So this week I'm celebrating Christmas by cooking the earliest ever Christmas dinner eaten at the South Pole. On Christmas Day in 1911, a group of explorers led by Captain Robert Falcon Scott were about a year and a half into their expedition to become the first ever people to reach the South Pole. As of Christmas Day in 1911, it would be another 23 days before they would reach the South Pole, where they would sadly discover that a Norwegian expedition reached the pole about a month beforehand. Famously, Scott's party faced some horrendous weather conditions on their return from the South Pole, and sadly none of them survived. But people were able to discover Captain Scott's diary, which details what sounds like an exhausted moment of pure, indulgent food bliss on Christmas Day in 1911. So I'm going to be recreating the Christmas dinner that Captain Scott describes in his diary to find out what an Antarctic Christmas meal tastes like. Scott actually had to add his description of his Christmas meal the day after because he was just too full to write in his journal. He says that their days trekking through crevasses and huge snowfields began with chocolate and raisins in the morning. These raisins are a long time past their sell-by date. However, the fact that these are probably past their best feels probably appropriate for what they were eating. It tastes good and a very nice way to start the day. He then goes on to say that their Christmas Day ended with a 4-course meal, which I'm going to recreate right now. So course 1 was pemmican, not pelican as some people think I've been pronouncing all week. Captain Scott describes his pemmican as full whack with slices of horse meat, flavoured with onion and curry powder and thickened with biscuit. So pemmican, as I've been reading this week, is kind of like a survivalist protein bar with preserved meat, animal fat and flavouring. I've read that it was originally a traditional food of indigenous populations of North America. Scott dates that their pemmican used horse meat. I have absolutely no qualms with the idea of eating horse meat, but I live in a country where eating horse meat is about the biggest culinary taboo you can make, and I've made my pemmican using venison. So to make this, I took lean strips of venison haunch and dehydrated them for 12 hours. I also did the same with some slices of onion, as that's mentioned as another component of Scott's pemmican. Once the meat and the onion had dried out, I used a food processor to turn it into a bit of a meaty powder. Upon discovering that my food processor wasn't up to task, I stuck it in a NutriBullet and it turned into a lovely meaty powder. The smell was quite incredible. Even though I deliberately avoided using horse meat, it did smell a bit like dog food. Captain Scott also mentions that the pemmican was thickened with biscuit, so I'm going to add in some homemade sledging biscuits and I'll come back to how I made them later. Next up, we need fat to bind it. Historically, you'd have just used the fat from whatever animal's meat you were preserving. As venison is quite lean, and my butcher gave me funny looks when I asked if he had any venison fat, I'm melting a combination of beef suet and dripping in a pan. Although the idea of frying off your curry spices first didn't really take hold in Britain until the 1980s, I'm choosing to mix my curry powder into the beef fat to take away the raw taste of the spices and to better integrate the flavour throughout my pemmican. Once the fat is fully melted and rendered, I'm slowly mixing it in with my meat and onion powder to firm it up. I'm then layering it in flat molds to set so that we can have our lovely pemmican bars. Taste time. I kind of feel like we've skipped a Boxing Day where everyone's trying to make a turkey curry out of the leftovers. The flavour is actually kind of tasty. The only downside is it's dry as hell, but it's almost like Captain Scott foresaw this. Captain Scott said that with their pemmican they made an arrowroot, cocoa and biscuit hoosh sweetened. Hoosh is kind of a slurried stew or porridge that mixes pemmican, biscuits and snow. So I'm going to make some expedition biscuits. The Terra Nova expedition that Scott led received their biscuits from a company called Huntley and Palmer's. However, the original recipe they've shared yields about 74 kilos worth of dough. So here's my adaptation of the original recipe. In a bowl, weigh out 150 grams of flour, 10 grams of sugar, 40 grams of lard, half a teaspoon of salt, half a teaspoon of sodium bicarbonate, and 50 mils of water. Slowly pour in the water and mix together to try and form a biscuit dough. Roll it out on your counter, cut into circles. If you want to be precise, Scott's biscuits weighed 2 ounces. Prick it with a fork if you want to trick your friends into dunking a lard biscuit into their tea. And then cook them for whatever amount of time you think is a good amount of time to cook biscuits for. I think I did about 15 minutes. Once cooked and cooled, we have sledging biscuits. Salty. This actually represents part of the sadness of their expedition though. During Captain Scott's expedition, nutritional science was very much in its early stages. Contemporary studies have shown that the expedition party were probably eating about 800 calories less a day than they should do. Part of that began with these biscuits. They just weren't nutrition and calorie rich enough. But this was no ordinary day, and they were using their biscuits to make Christmas hoosh. So to a couple of bars of pemmican, we're adding a couple of biscuits, a tablespoon of arrowroot, which they would use for flavour, some raisins for sweetness, as they say, and snow. So now we've got our hoosh. Let's see how this goes. Okay, so now we've blended up our snow, venison pemmican, biscuit, cocoa, and arrowroot with raisins to get hoosh. Every time I do this, I feel like this is actually probably the thing I'm most scared about trying. You know when I said that my pemmican tasted very dry? I can tell you that the solution is not to add in cocoa powder and raisins. I would have stuck with the pemmican bar personally, but happy Christmas, guys. So after the pemmican, Scott writes in his diary that the next course was a plum pudding, often referred to in the UK as Christmas pudding. For British people, plum pudding, Christmas pudding, whatever you call it, it forms a key place on our Christmas dinner tables. You make a plum pudding by mixing together fruit, suet, spices, and steaming it in a pudding cloth for up to 8 hours, which is where I decided to honour Captain Scott's expedition by bringing along a pre-made one. There are still quite a lot of Christian traditions mixed into this pudding. Apparently a traditional plum pudding should have 13 ingredients to represent the 12 disciples and, you know, him. Families would traditionally mix their pudding together on the last Sunday before Advent, which they'd call Stir Up Sunday. Families would have to stir it from east to west to symbolise the journey of the 3 wise men to the birth of Christ. And the flaming brandy on top was supposed to represent the passion of the Christ. It's a ladle full of booze, it's not burning. Sod it. I've got the world's only non-flaming alcoholic brandy. Is it actually real brandy? Yeah, that's real. Oh, that's so good. It's sticky and sweet and thick and spiced. That is what would make me think of Christmas if I was hundreds of miles from home. At this point, they had a little festive palate cleanser with hot cocoa and raisins. I don't know if I'd be able to have that just after a whole Christmas pudding, but again, if you're on meagre rations to begin with, I'd chug this. And then they rounded off their meals with ginger and caramels. Eating that caramel just feels like Christmas Day. You've had a huge meal, and yet you somehow find room for that tub of Quality Street or that chocolate orange. The crystallized ginger too, that just feels like another lovely Christmassy flavour to round it all off. In Scott's diary, Scott wrote, "After the feast, it was difficult to move. Wilson and I couldn't finish our share of plum pudding. We've all slept splendidly and feel thoroughly warm. Such is the effect of full feeding." It's a timeless and poignant story, and it remains really hard to read through their diary entries. But honestly, I just love reading about their Christmas meal. So I say to them and to you, Merry Christmas. Thank you for sticking with me through all of that. Please subscribe if you'd like to see more. Comment if there's a food story from history you'd like me to recreate. It's been a long year. I don't know what I'm doing in 2024 yet.